In 1987, a journalist working a fairly routine assignment for the Sun newspaper stumbled across something that, when it finally made its way into print, genuinely stopped the country in its tracks. It wasn't a scandal involving an affair or a financial controversy or some embarrassing leaked letter. It was something quieter, sadder, and in a lot of ways far more disturbing than the usual category of royal scandal because it wasn't really about something the royal family had done. It was about two people the royal family had, for all practical purposes, made disappear. Two first cousins of Queen Elizabeth II, two young women with the surname Bowes-Lyon, the very same family name as the Queen Mother herself. And for nearly half a century, almost nobody outside of a small circle of relatives and hospital staff had any idea that they existed at all, let alone that one of them was, at the time the story broke, still alive. Their names were Nerissa and Katherine Bowes-Lyon. Nerissa was born in February of 1919 in Chelsea, London. Katherine came along 7 years later, in 1926. Their father was John Herbert Bowes-Lyon, the brother of the woman who would later become Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, wife of King George VI and mother of the future Queen Elizabeth II. That makes the connection here about as direct and close as royal family ties get. These weren't distant cousins several times removed, lost somewhere in the tangled branches of an aristocratic family tree. Nerissa and Katherine were the Queen's first cousins, sharing the very same grandparents, the Earl and Countess of Strathmore and Kinghorn. On paper, they belonged to one of the most prominent, most photographed, most carefully documented families in the entire world. In reality, they spent almost their entire lives in an institution that most of Britain had never heard of, forgotten by the very family whose name they carried. Both sisters were born with severe intellectual disabilities. According to the medical understanding and terminology of the era, which by today's standards sounds genuinely uncomfortable and outdated, the sisters were classified using a term that's no longer used in any respectful or clinical context today, but which essentially indicated what would now be described as a profound developmental disability. They reportedly had a mental age of around 3 years old, and neither of them ever learned to speak. Their father, John Bowes-Lyon, died of pneumonia in 1930, when Nerissa was just 11 and Katherine only 4, leaving their mother Fenella to raise 4 children, 2 of whom required round-the-clock specialized care that a single parent in that era, even one connected to enormous wealth and aristocratic privilege, would have found genuinely difficult to provide alone at home. In 1941, when Nerissa was 22 years old and Katherine was just 15, the two sisters were sent to live at the Royal Earlswood Institution for Mental Defectives, located in Redhill, Surrey. The institution's name alone tells you everything you need to know about how British society at the time approached disability, conditions that today would be discussed with compassion, nuance, and an entire framework of specialized education and support were, in the language of the 1940s, simply labeled as defects, and the people who had them were, in the eyes of much of society, essentially written off. What's particularly striking, and what historians researching this story have noted, is that the sisters weren't the only members of their extended family sent there. On that exact same day, in 1941, 3 of their cousins on their mother's side, sisters named Idonia, Rosemary, and Etheldrada Fane, who also had similar developmental disabilities, were admitted to the very same institution. 5 young women from one interconnected aristocratic family, all quietly placed into the same facility on the same day, as though the family had collectively decided to deal with what they likely saw, in the deeply prejudiced language of the era, as an inconvenient and embarrassing problem, all at once. Royal Earlswood itself had been built back in 1847 as one of the very first institutions in Britain specifically designed for people with intellectual disabilities. By the time Nerissa and Katherine arrived there in the 1940s, it housed roughly 230 people. Later testimony from nurses and from relatives of other former residents, gathered for a documentary made decades later, describe the conditions inside as regimented, with wards housing as many as 40 people looked after by just 2 nurses at a time. It wasn't necessarily a place of overt cruelty or active abuse, by most accounts, but it was also, by every description that's emerged since, a deeply institutional, joyless environment, the kind of place built to manage and contain, rather than to nurture or genuinely care for the people inside it in any rich individual sense. And here is where the story moves from being simply a sad reflection of mid-century British attitudes toward disability into something that genuinely shocked the public when it eventually came out. Because what happened next wasn't just neglect through circumstance. It looks, by almost every account that has emerged in the decades since, like a deliberate, calculated effort to erase the 2 sisters from the official record entirely. In 1963, a new edition of Burke's Peerage was published. For anyone unfamiliar with it, Burke's Peerage is essentially the definitive genealogical reference work for the British aristocracy, a meticulously researched, regularly updated record of who belongs to which noble family, who their parents and children are, when they were born, and when they died. It is, in theory, an authoritative, accurate historical document, the kind of thing genealogists and historians rely on to track aristocratic lineages with confidence. And in that 1963 edition, Nerissa Bowes-Lyon was listed as having died in 1940. Katherine was listed as having died in 1961. Both entries were completely false. Nerissa was alive in 1963 and would remain alive for more than another 2 decades, finally passing away in January of 1986. Katherine was alive too, and would go on living for over 50 more years after her supposed death date, not passing away until 2014, at the age of 80-7. When the story eventually broke publicly in 1987, it caused exactly the kind of stir you'd expect, and then some. A journalist had discovered that Katherine Bowes-Lyon, listed as dead in the most authoritative aristocratic record in the country for over 2 decades, was in fact alive and still living at Royal Earlswood Hospital. Nerissa, it turned out, had only recently died the year before, in 1986, having spent her entire adult life, more than 4 decades, inside that same institution, all while officially recorded as having died as a teenager back in 1940. Burke's Peerage, for its part, insisted that they had simply printed the information that had been provided to them directly by the Bowes-Lyon family itself. In other words, according to the publishers of this supposedly definitive aristocratic record, somebody within the family had actively told them, falsely, that these 2 women were dead, years and in some cases decades before they actually died. Think about what that actually means for a moment, because it's worth sitting with. This wasn't a case of an institution losing track of paperwork or a clerical mix-up between similarly named individuals or some innocent miscommunication that snowballed over time. This was, according to the very organization responsible for the published record, information that came directly from the family. Somebody at some point had to make the choice to tell a major reference publication that 2 living members of their own family were dead. And once that lie made its way into print in a respected, authoritative genealogical record, it effectively became the official version of events for an entire generation. Nobody researching the Bowes-Lyon family tree, nobody writing about the Queen Mother's relatives, nobody with even a passing professional interest in the aristocracy had any reason to question it, because Burke's Peerage was exactly the kind of source you were supposed to be able to trust without question. When the news broke in 1987, The public reaction was a complicated mixture of genuine shock, sympathy for the two women, and real anger directed at the royal family and the wider Bowes-Lyon family for what looked, on the surface, like a calculated decades-long cover-up designed purely to avoid the embarrassment and social stigma of having disabled relatives. This was happening, it's worth remembering, within living memory of a royal family that had spent much of the 20th century cultivating an extremely careful, polished public image of normalcy, stability, and quiet moral authority. The idea that the family had effectively hidden two of its own members away in an institution and then had them declared dead in the official record simply to avoid any embarrassment or any disruption to that carefully managed public image struck a real nerve, and rightly so. There were even rumors at the time, never substantiated, suggesting some kind of deeper royal cover-up extending beyond just these two sisters. Rumors that tend to attach themselves to stories like this whenever the full picture isn't immediately clear and the public is left to fill in gaps with speculation. It, quote, "'s worth pausing here to be fair and to present the more sympathetic interpretation that some family members have offered over the years, because the full picture is genuinely more complicated than a simple, cold-blooded cover-up narrative, even if the central facts remain deeply uncomfortable." Lady Elizabeth Shakerley, a niece of Nerissa and Katherine, pushed back publicly against the idea that the sisters were treated as some kind of shameful, hidden secret within the family. She has stated that far from being a taboo subject, the two women were actually visited and remembered by family members, and that the family's failure to maintain closer contact reflected the limitations and attitudes of the era more broadly, rather than some unique, deliberate, royal-specific cruelty. It's true that attitudes toward intellectual disability throughout most of the 20th century, across British society generally, and not just within aristocratic families, were harsh by today's standards. Institutionalization was an extremely common response to a child being born with a significant developmental disability, particularly among wealthy families who had the financial means to place a child in a private facility rather than caring for them at home, and the broader culture, frankly, encouraged precisely this kind of quiet, distant management of disability rather than open acknowledgement and inclusion. So, in that sense, what happened to Nerissa and Katherine reflects a genuinely uncomfortable, broader truth about how an entire society, not just one family, often dealt with disability during this period, treating it as something to be managed privately and kept out of public view rather than addressed with anything resembling the support, dignity, or openness that we would expect today. But that broader context, as important as it is for understanding the era, doesn't fully explain away the specific, documented falsification of the official genealogical record. Plenty of families across Britain during this period made the painful decision to place a severely disabled child in residential care. That alone wouldn't have made international headlines decades later or generated the kind of public anger that this particular story did. What made this case different, what turned a sad but unfortunately common story of mid-century institutionalization into a genuine scandal, was the apparent decision to actively misrepresent these women as deceased in an official published record for years, in some cases for decades, seemingly to remove any administrative or social trace of their continued existence. That's a different category of action entirely from simply placing a child in a care facility. That's an active, sustained effort at erasure. Their quote S also a deeper layer to this story that's worth exploring, because it connects to broader questions about hereditary succession, bloodlines, and the particular pressures that come with belonging to a royal or aristocratic family whose entire social position depends on lineage and the public perception of that lineage being, in some sense, exemplary. Throughout history, royal families across Europe have had a long and well-documented, often genuinely disturbing pattern of dealing with relatives who had disabilities, mental illness, or any condition perceived as deviating from the image of a strong, capable, legitimate ruling family by hiding them away, sometimes literally locking them in distant castles or country estates, sometimes simply removing them from public record and public memory entirely. The British royal family, despite its modern reputation for relative restraint and dignity compared to some of its European counterparts historically, was clearly not immune to exactly this same instinct when it came to two young women whose disabilities didn't fit comfortably within the image the family wanted to project to the public during the mid-20th century, an image of stability, vigor, and quiet moral rectitude that had become especially important during and after the strain of the Second World War. What happened to Nerissa and Katherine also raises a genuinely important and uncomfortable question that historians and disability advocates have raised in revisiting this story in more recent years, which is how much agency and consideration the two women themselves were actually given in any of these decisions. They couldn't speak. They couldn't advocate for themselves. They had no ability to contact extended family, to express whether they were content with their circumstances, or to push back against being effectively erased from the family's public narrative. Every single decision made about their lives, where they lived, how they were cared for, and ultimately how their existence was represented to the wider world, was made entirely by other people, without any input from the two people whose lives were actually most directly affected. That's a sobering thing to sit with regardless of how you interpret the broader question of family intention or era-appropriate context, because whatever the motivations involved, two human beings spent their entire adult lives essentially voiceless in decisions that shaped literally everything about their existence. The aftermath of the story, breaking in 1987, brought renewed, if belated, attention to the sisters' situation. Katherine, who was still alive at the time the story emerged, continued living at what had by then been renamed simply Royal Earlswood Hospital, and lived for another 27 years after the public finally learned of her existence, eventually passing away in February of 2014 at the age of 87. There's something genuinely poignant in the fact that for the final decades of her life, after spending most of her existence completely unknown to the public, Katherine Bowes-Lyon's story became at least somewhat known, even if she herself, given the severity of her disability, would likely never have been able to understand or process the public attention and sympathy that eventually came her way, so many decades too late to change anything about how she had actually lived. This story has continued to resurface periodically in the years since, often discussed in articles and documentaries exploring lesser-known or uncomfortable chapters of royal family history, and it tends to generate the same reaction every time it's rediscovered by a new audience who hadn't previously heard of it. A kind of genuine shock that something like this could have happened, could have been actively concealed for decades, and could have involved members of a family whose every public move, whose weddings and birthdays and public appearances were otherwise documented in exhaustive, almost obsessive detail by the British press and the public alike. It's a stark illustration of just how selectively that documentation and attention actually operated. The same family whose engagements were tracked in newspapers down to the smallest detail, whose every public appearance was photographed and analyzed, was also capable of having two members essentially vanish from public record for nearly half a century, with the only acknowledgement of their existence being a deliberately falsified entry in a reference book stating they were already dead. It quote, worth thinking too about how this story sits alongside other moments in royal history, where the family's instinct for image management collided uncomfortably with the messier, more complicated reality of actual human lives. The royal family has, over centuries, developed an extraordinarily sophisticated set of tools for shaping public perception, deciding what gets shown to the world and what stays carefully hidden behind palace walls. Most of the time, that instinct manifests in relatively benign ways, choosing flattering photographs, managing press access, controlling the narrative around weddings and ceremonies and public engagements. But the story of Nerissa and Katherine Bowes-Lyon shows what that same instinct can look like when applied to something far more serious and far more consequential than simply managing a public image. When the thing being hidden isn't an unflattering photograph or an awkward diplomatic moment, but the actual existence of two living human beings, the stakes and the moral weight of that kind of concealment become something else entirely. In recent years, as conversations about disability rights, institutional history, and the treatment of disabled people throughout the 20th century have become more prominent and more nuanced in public discourse, the story of the Bowes-Lyon sisters has been revisited with a somewhat different lens than the purely scandal-driven coverage it received back in 1987. Disability historians and advocates have used their story as a case study and entry point into broader conversations about how an entire society, not just one prominent family, systematically failed people with intellectual disabilities throughout much of the 20th century, treating institutionalization and concealment as the default, expected response rather than genuine care, inclusion, or support. Viewed through that lens, Nerissa and Katherine's story becomes less a story exclusively about royal scandal and more a story about a much wider, much more pervasive societal failure, one in which the royal family's particular version of that failure simply happened to be more dramatic, more thoroughly documented, and ultimately more publicly exposed than countless similar, quieter family tragedies that played out across Britain during the exact same decades, involving ordinary families with no royal connections at all, whose stories never made international headlines because nobody was checking whether their relatives' supposed death dates in some reference book actually matched reality. So what do we actually take away from this story all these decades later? Perhaps it's this: the British royal family, for all of its carefully cultivated mystique, for all of the pageantry and tradition and image control that has surrounded it for centuries, is ultimately made up of real human beings, with all of the same flaws, fears, prejudices, and capacity for both compassion and failure that exist in any family, anywhere. The instinct to hide away two young women whose disabilities didn't fit the image the family wanted to project to the world wasn't some unique royal pathology. It was a deeply human, deeply flawed response shaped by the prejudices of its era, amplified perhaps by the particular pressures that come with maintaining a public image of strength and stability, but fundamentally recognizable as the same kind of painful, complicated family secret that countless other families, royal and otherwise, have grappled with throughout history. What makes the story of Nerissa and Katherine Bowes-Lyon stand out? What makes it the kind of secret that genuinely shocked Britain when it finally came to light is the sheer scale and apparent deliberateness of the concealment, the audacity of having two living women officially declared dead in print for years on end, and the uncomfortable reminder it provides that even the most thoroughly documented, most constantly photographed family in the country was still capable of making two of its own members disappear almost entirely for nearly 50 years, until a single newspaper investigation finally brought their quiet, largely unwitnessed lives back into the light.